Hello, everyone. Welcome to this panel on From Economic Diplomacy to Economic Statecraft, a new mercantilism in an era of de-globalization. I'm Linda Yueh. I'm visiting professor at LSE Ideas, and I know we're delighted to be co-organizing this wonderful virtual event with the Brussels School of Governance. I'm going to introduce our speakers who will give their opening remarks in turn, and then there'll be a chance for a Q&A. So if you'd like to ask a question of any of them, please put it into the Q&A box, and we'll certainly have time towards the end of this panel to get the thoughts from all the participants of this event. We are joined by Simon Evenett. He's Professor of International Trade and Economic Development and MBA Director at the University of St. Gallen. So he's joining us from St. Gallen, Switzerland. We're also joined by Manuela Moschella. She's Associate Professor of International Political Economy at the Scuola Normale Superiore in Florence. And so she's joining us from Italy. And Patrick Lowe, former chief economist at the World Trade Organization and an honorary professor of international economics at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. So we've got two people joining us from Switzerland, one from Italy, and I'm based here in the UK. I'm not going to spend very much time on introducing the topic. I almost think every single word in the panel description warrants a lecture in and of itself. So economic diplomacy, this essentially a connecting of economic aims with diplomatic aims, and this project that I've leading at the LSE Ideas, which is, I'm chair of the LSE Economic Diplomacy Commission. We really look at how you align trade and investment policy in a country's global role with its foreign policy, development policy, intelligence writ large. And this framework, I think, has become more important perhaps than it has for quite a long time for a country to align its various aims. And so I think economic diplomacy as a framework is evolving, and I think has become more interesting. And then to economic statecraft, the deployment of these tools, the conduct, I think is also something that I'm sure we will explore on the policy front, what it all means. A new mercantilism, thinking back to the Corn Laws of 1846, when we thought mercantilism had been defeated as the concept of the day, and then its reemergence in the early 20th century. And I think we are at a point where there may also be another shift in terms of consensus around mercantilism, and in which case, I think that leads to the final word in this panel description is that are we really facing, because this is a question, a new mercantilism, even if the term is being revived more? Is this because we are in an era of de-globalization? So I think the title of this panel foreshadows what's coming, which is going to be a very lively discussion of these huge topics by this wonderful panel of speakers. So with that, Simon, I'm going to hand over to you for your opening remarks.
Thank you, Linda, for the introduction and for the opportunity to speak on this panel. I've been asked to talk about the changing essence of commercial diplomacy. In doing so, one could think about this in terms of either ends or means. I'm going to reflect much more on the ends, not because I think the means have remained static, but I think the more interesting developments on the ends. I'm also going to refer primarily to the choices of central governments in their diplomacy. I've been doing a lot of work in more recent years on what local and state governments have been doing, which have cross-border spillovers. I'm not going to talk about that here. I will focus on central diplomacy. If we talk about the changing essence, then what have we changed from? Well, if we go back 25 to 30 years, and if you asked most trade policy analysts what was the overarching objective, it was deal making. Robert Zoellick always asked his staffers, when presented with any FTA or trade agreement, what is the basis of the deal, who gets what, and the deals were based around improving access to markets, introducing new rules, normally for non-discrimination, equal treatment, transparency, due process, and sometimes the deals were about resolving disputes between countries. And this was the core of commercial diplomacy. If we go forward 25 years, we see other ends getting much more attention than that. And I have identified 5 that I'll run through very quickly. The first goal, it seems to me, of a lot of commercial diplomacy these days is to preserve the room for maneuver for a government to respond to geopolitical trends, threats, unusual, unexpected circumstances like pandemics. So actually, a lot of the diplomacy is about stopping the encroachment on room for maneuver. And we see this in how governments want to preserve space for things like industrial policy in response to the rise of China. We see that in governments being very reluctant to take on any obligations of the WTO to stop bans on the exportation of medical equipment and medical goods in a pandemic. And we also see governments preserving the rights to start screening foreign direct investments on national security grounds. So it's almost as if the purpose of commercial diplomacy has been completely reversed. Instead of assigning agreements to tie hands, it's actually to preserve room for maneuver. And I think that's the headline point I would make. The second purpose seems to me to have commercial diplomacy to develop coalitions against a party that you do not like or you are worried about. So if you're based in North America and Western Europe, these are coalitions against China. If you're based in the BRICS, these are coalitions against the United States and the West. And so commercial diplomacy around coalition formation, I think, is the second important dimension that we've seen, and we saw a lot of that on display this weekend at the G7. And before that, of course, there were talks about the D10, and we can see this, I think, being a second important objective. A third important objective of commercial diplomacy in an era of geopolitical rivalry seems to be persuading trading partners not to engage with some third party, China, whoever you want to think of, in some key commercial relationships. So let's step back from the abstract, intangible terms. When the United States tries to persuade its trading partners not to buy equipment from Huawei, this is a form of diplomacy where essentially the US is trying to get its trading partners to change their behavior vis-a-vis a party that they are worried about. So that seems to be the third objective. A fourth objective, perhaps more constructive forward-looking one, is to try and have commercial diplomacy to set the standards for the future regulations in areas where regulations have not yet really been come into fruition. And so you saw the US and the EU recently deciding to put together a Trade and Technology Council to formulate future rules for artificial intelligence, for example. Now, in the past, we've had attempts to do this. They haven't been terribly successful, but it doesn't mean that they couldn't be successful in the future. So even though we can't agree on rules for existing where they exist at the moment, reforming rules where they exist at the moment, we could come to an agreement on future rules. That's the fourth area. And the fifth area, we're seeing commercial diplomacy interact with national security concerns are areas where we're seeing very interesting heterodox issue linkage. And perhaps the best example of this is in how the US is dealing with Germany on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And there's a strong hint here that what for the US is a national, what they see as a national security issue, the trade-offs which they are prepared to engage in, or the deals they're prepared to do with the Germans, are ones which could involve some very heterodox issue linkage that we haven't seen before. So I would emphasize these 5 areas. What do they mean for for where globalization is going? Let me make 3 points and then I'll stop. The first, which is very clear, is that traditional trade policy objectives, the ones I articulated at the beginning, have been very clearly subordinated to geopolitical and public health objectives. It's almost as if trade ministries have been sidelined quite seriously. And that makes you ask the question, whose commercial diplomacy? Who is driving this commercial diplomacy? So that's the first observation. The second is, as we're seeing the geopolitical rivalry with the Chinese pick up and the European and the US responses to it, we are seeing in North America and Western Europe resort to a lot of subsidization. In fact, if anything, Western economic policy is becoming more Chinese. We're doing more of the subsidizations that we criticize the Chinese for. I suspect most of the policy interventions will not be about shutting firms out of markets, except in very sensitive national security areas. Much of the trade distortions we will see will not be trade barriers, they will be subsidies, which leads me to the second point, which is that I don't think the world will deglobalize. I just think it will be a more and more bastardized version of globalization. And one where the analytical mistake is to think that just because markets are open, the absence of barriers, that doesn't mean the trade isn't very heavily distorted. And the third point I would make is that much of this new commercial diplomacy, or the commercial diplomacy around these five ends that I've just described, will take place outside of the formal international organizations, mainly in bilateral forums like the G7 and the like, or in other groupings. And so where commercial diplomacy is conducted, I think will migrate as well. And I think that's another implication of the world that we're currently in. I hope this helped lay some of the groundwork for a future discussion. Thank you.
So incredibly interesting and excellent presentation. Thank you, Simon. We'll now turn to Manuela, and I do believe you have some slides, so I look forward to seeing those.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you for the introduction. Thanks for having me. And now I'm going to show off all my technological skills, trying to share my few slides with you. I assume you can see it, right? Yes, thank you so much. So if Simon was talking about commercial diplomacy, I'm gonna switch to a different issue area. I'm gonna talk more about finance and global financial governance in general. And I'm gonna address some themes of this very interesting workshop by focusing on a particular kind of economic actors, namely central banks, who have become extremely important over the past two recent crises, and to see how their actions have kind of affected global financial governance, financial diplomacy in general, and in general, political trends. And so where does power lie, since we're talking about economic statecraft? And so really the overall question that I'm gonna discuss it with you is whether, based on the experience of central banks and their actions during the recent crisis experience, we're gonna see major transformations or continuities in how global financial governance is run. So about all the mechanisms to ensure financial stability and really who holds power in global financial governance. And just to anticipate some of my conclusions here, I think that we see a lot of continuities in terms of where how power relationships are organized in spite of the recent crisis experience. And I also agree with what Simon was telling about me, speaking about the title of this session. I don't really see any deglobalization seriously going on. But globalization is still with us, even in the realm of financial diplomacy. So just as a background here, why are central banks so important in this discussion? Central banks have always been historically key actors in financial diplomacy, in financial relationships among countries. So what has recently happened with the pandemic is not an entirely new phenomena. Just looking back in time, here I have gold, just to remind about we were talking about back in the day of the gold standard, you know, going back to the famous Mary Eichengreen's argument, the gold standard was profoundly supported by central bank cooperation. So basically, especially before World War I, the First World War, central banks operated differently when they were in normal times or in crisis times. And in particular, when they were in emergency times, they collaborated with each other in order to avoid financial crisis. And that ensured the smooth operation of the global financial system. But it was not just back in the day. I mean, central bank cooperation and their role in these relationships and power relationships among countries has always been crucial in finance. Going back to more recent days, here are the data on the swap lines among central banks that have taken place in recent times. So really the support going on among central banks during times of financial market stress. And as you can see from the flows here, this has been a significant amount of money flowing, especially at least in the previous crisis from the United States with the role, of course, of the dollar as the reserve currency. But central banks do not only have this direct role in international financial stability of the kind that I just described, they also exert a more informal role. They have an informal channel through which they affect power relationships among countries, and they help ensure financial stability by way of their domestic mandate. And this, of course, mostly apply to high-income countries, because we all know that monetary policy may have spillover effects, right? International consequences. And again, this is nothing new. If we go back with the memory to the 1980s, when the United States started raising interest rates, this was the beginning of the debt crisis in Latin America and the lost decade. So it's really ringing, probably not reassuring alarm bell today with the news coming up from the US Fed yesterday. So this is the role that central banks can play in global financial markets. So it has always been there, but if possible, it has become even bigger, right, in the last 15 years with their unconventional policies. And here is just, a graph that we have all been familiar over the past decade, with a huge expansion of the central bank's balance sheet. This is really the US Fed, which is, of course, really epitomizes what has been going on in most advanced economies. And just for the sake of having a complete picture, on the left-hand side, you have what happened in the preceding crisis from 2008, basically 2008, 2010, and even and on the right-hand side, you have what happened with the COVID crisis. So in both cases, this huge amount of money pumped into the system by especially central banks in high-income countries, which is, of course, are directed mainly to domestic markets. But since they move the markets, since they direct investments behavior, they strongly affect also emerging and developing market economies. And this is, of course, a reference to what happened back in 2013 with the so-called taper tantrum, when the Fed started announcing its intention to taper this massive amount of stimulus that it directed to the US economy, starting a sell-off in global financial markets and affecting several emerging market countries, especially those with the worst current account balances. So where does this lead us to? I want to make just 2/3 conclusions. The first is an implication number one is that what we are seeing recently, it's really more a continuity with the past, with what we know about, power relationship in global financial governance at large, in the sense that the relationship between high-income countries and emerging and developing countries continues to be unbalanced, right? So what happens in emerging market countries has the potential to make emerging market countries and developing economies extremely vulnerable, even if it's not of their own making. So what happens, I mean, in advanced economies has huge consequences, even down the lines. And so these are the setup in which emerging and developing countries operate and they have to deal with. So we still have this unbalanced relationship in the global financial system that especially the weakest countries have to deal with. The second important implication is about the relationship between public and private authority here, okay? Because of course, if we consider central banks as public authority, what has been happening over the past 15 years could be considered an example of public authorities, central banks, effectively steering the markets to their purposes. Okay, this huge amount of money pushed into the system by central banks was in a certain, we can discuss about how effective they were, but they were able to steer market in certain directions. So this could be taken as a proof that public authority had kind of the upper hand. But at the same time, it's a complicated two-way relationship, because also as the taper example, the taper tantrum example indicates, I mean, central banks have really found enormous difficulties in going in a direction that was not kind of pleased by the markets. So every time central bankers have been trying to taper or to make announcements that were not exactly aligned with market expectations, they more often than not were forced to take a step back. So these really talk about this complicated relationship between public and private authority, and how private markets and private authority can still have a huge role to play, especially in these integrated financial markets. So no change at all. I think that if I have to kind of single out areas where probably we are going to see more changes, it's not in the traditional areas that we study when we study global financial governance. So in the relationship between groups of countries according to income, or in the public-private relationship, but probably we're seeing more change in areas that are becoming more and more important, from green finance to digital currencies, because these are the areas where, at least apparently, it's a moving target, of course, but these trends in terms of power relationships among countries and public and private is changing significantly. Think about the digital currencies, right? I mean, the competition that the potential creation of a China's digital currencies will have on the dominance of the US dollar is going to be remarkable, and it will change not only the relationship among countries according to income, but really it will change also how it will be shaped up, the relationship between public and private authority in financial governance. And the same, I think, it goes for green finance. Of course, it very much depends on the amount of the involvement of central banks and other public regulators. But these are probably the areas coming out from the recent crisis where, more than traditional, financial flows and the like, where more change is going to be detected. And I'll stop it here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manuela. There's a lot there that I hope we can pick up afterwards. All incredibly interesting. Before I invite Patrick to give his opening comments, a reminder to participants, if you have a question for the panelists, please put it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you'd like a particular person to answer it, please feel free to name them. With that, Patrick, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Linda. I'm going to talk about what many people would think, and if we take Simon's analysis, which I think is very persuasive and in a way is the backstory for what's happening to the trading system and the WTO, I'm going to just talk briefly about what the WTO is facing. It's obviously no secret that it's facing very difficult times. Everybody talks about WTO reform and says how important it's going to be. It's really not clear what the contours of a serious reform program would look like. And I think that does speak to some fundamental changes in the way the system is operated in recent years. It's really 25 years, I think, since the WTO stopped functioning effectively as a negotiating forum. There have been one or two negotiating results, but against the background of a failed negotiating round. And I think also it's probably true to say that if you can't negotiate, it's very difficult to fulfill the other functions of the system, namely to monitor and manage the agreements and also to settle disputes. Now, there's a long list of things that I could mention, and I'll try and mention some of them briefly in passing. But at the core of this, I think it's hard not to come to the conclusion that fundamentally what we're looking at is rivalry, is geopolitical rivalry, and what drives that between China and the US. And so the way this manifests itself in the WTO is a sort of alliance, somewhat loose, but nevertheless an alliance between the US, EU, and Japan on the one side and China on the other, talking about state ownership, state trading, the role of subsidies. And on the wish list of the US, EU, Japan statements on this is the following: the assertion of the primacy of market-based outcomes, just for starters. Really tightening up subsidies on things like credit guarantees, debt forgiveness, rescuing insolvent companies, establishment of international accounting standards, standardized corporate law, much stronger rules on transparency and notification, and other slightly more detailed issues, but still quite fundamental, such as how do you define a public body? China's riposte has been, in quite general terms, stick with the core principles of WTO. They say, respect developing countries and their rights, stick with a consensus principle, and ensure mutual respect for different development models. So you can see there isn't much common ground between these positions, and I think that's something that would clearly have to be worked through. There has to be a willingness among those parties to actually see the WTO do something, and that's really where Simon's analysis comes in. Are we going to see that? So nobody wants to call time on multilateralism. Nobody wants to call time on the WTO. Everyone's talking about reform, but that's the first item on the agenda that I think is going to have to be addressed. But it's not the only one by any means, and many of the others also impinge on these relationships. But not only these relationships, other players become important too in the mix. So the whole question of differential treatment for developing countries, the appropriate balance of rights and obligations in the system. We could go on forever on this one. It's been with us since the very beginning, and it's as intense now as it ever was, and just as stuck as it ever was. Who's entitled to this? What does it mean if you say you're a developing country? Should that determine the level of your rights? All those questions, which are stuck, frankly, at the moment. The dispute settlement system is in crisis. It's actually ceased to function in any really meaningful sense since the United States blocked the appellate body on grounds that I think it's fair to say not only the United States has been concerned about: overreach, disregarding the terms of reference. Underlying this, of course, is the fact that dispute settlement after the Euro round became a matter of consensus. It was no longer possible to block outcomes. So people got a lot more sensitive about what those outcomes were. Agriculture. Agriculture is endless discussions about agriculture. Less than 5% of everything in the world economy, and yet wags the tail of the system, as it has for so long. Transparency, there is a massive lack of observance of obligations to inform. Dozens of countries are simply not doing it properly. There's this ongoing negotiation which comes out of the failed Doha round on fisheries subsidies. You would have thought that was something that should be reasonably easy to fix, but no, and the struggle goes on. Then there's the whole delicate area of decision making, and the ministerial meeting in Buenos Aires in 2017. There was the development of these things called joint statement initiatives, which are essentially the idea that a subset of membership can go and negotiate. There's the presumption that the outcome will still be non-discriminatory, but that assumption is clearly being questioned. So if one were to try to identify the core issue that possibly will sink the institution, institutions don't die, do they? But sink it as a potentially effective venue, as it has been in the past, will be if there's a lot of talk now, especially coming from the US side, of breaking away from the most favored nation principle. And one of the areas where this has become most obvious is in the negotiations on e-commerce, the whole digital economy, how to regulate the digital economy. The WTO rules are seriously out of date. And so this negotiation is going along, and it's going slowly. But the undertones of this discussion are, well, we can't agree on anything serious here unless we ditch the most favored nation principle, unless we ditch non-discrimination. That's clearly where some of the parties are coming from, mostly in relation to excluding China, because China and the United States and all the other significant countries are in this negotiation. It's about 86 of the 164 members of the WTO who are in there. And so I really wonder where that is going to take us. So that's not the whole list, but probably the main issues are in there. I think services is also important. Regulation, proper regulation of trade and services. Investment facilitation, which some people see as a backdoor for actually getting more serious about dealing with investment in the WTO. One could go on for a long time. I think the picture is bleak, and really, if you want to look at an institution which in many ways has stood for multilateralism and in a more even-handed sort of way because of the most favored nation principle and because of consensus decision making, there's a real question over its future. So I just hope my pension is safe. Thank you.
Patrick, I think your pension is safe. As you say, institutions never quite die, but maybe become less relevant. But that was really thoughtful, and and just another excellent presentation. Thank you. If anybody, the participants, would like to ask a question, please pop it into the Q&A box, and I will come to those in a moment. I think I would probably like to push the panel a little bit on the title of the session, which is from what we've heard, with possibly the exception of Manuela, because central banks seem to be more coordinated, at least during crises, than the other organs of government. Is this pattern of fragmentation, that we're seeing, that's been described by the panel, does it constitute a new mercantilism? Because I think the panels agree it's not de-globalization, but it is a different globalization. Does it amount to a new mercantilism in the sense that our country is aiming for trade surpluses? I think Simon's put forward the argument that indeed, in some respects, trade is being subsumed beneath other aims. Is this a new mercantilism, or is that not quite the right word to describe this very shifting world in which we live? So Simon, since I'll come to you first.
Thank you, Linda. I mean, I like the way you framed it, because it makes us think, what is it that governments are trying to achieve, right? Mercantilism emphasizes the trade balance as the KPI, to use business school language. Okay, what is the new KPI? Well, I think there's a sort of hierarchy of them. Insofar as governments are worried about their country's primacy in the world, if you're the United States, or you're worried about attacks on your critical infrastructure, cyber attacks, then issues of primacy and security, these matters, and these are of course not quantifiable, these are intangibles. Those are clearly objectives which are driving policy. That's what some are trying to accomplish. Then you can go down to a second level of objectives. When you look at the discussions that governments are having on digital regulation and on digital taxation, this is not about trade surpluses. This is about grabbing profits or grabbing taxes on profits. It's about getting your share of those, or if you can. And so there, the objective, I think, is different from a classic mercantilist one. To the extent that by mercantilism, you mean, or one could mean, that a country is seeking advantage irrespective of whether it's at the cost of anyone else, then clearly we see governments are operating that manner. But I think that perspective ignores the primary KPIs I mentioned, which is the real fears of loss of primacy if you're the United States, and what that means for your position in the world and technological superiority, and then also the real concerns that in a digital world, the ability of one country to be able to attack infrastructures which are central to our livelihoods. These are that fear, I think, is really dominant, and the tax grab and the grab for market shares, which we're seeing with all the subsidy actions, these are second order in the world. But I would be very interested if either you or anyone else on the panel or in the audience thought that there was a better characterization, or if mine is wrong.
Thank you, Simon. Yeah, really clear and really interesting and thought-provoking. Manuela, same question to you and the new mercantilism.
Thank you, Linda. This is an excellent question, and it's also a very difficult and nuanced question when it comes, to financial flows. And let me use the kind of questions that Simon was asking in reflecting on your questions. So if we think about mercantilism, so the first question to ask is to try to dig deeper into what are governments, public authorities' intention, right, when they take certain policies here. And if I have to think about, central banks' policies in the recent decade, I don't think that, the interventions they have done have been motivated by the pursuit of any advantage, irrespective of what happened outside. So it's not that even what happened in the United States, that the Fed, while it pumped the system with money, it did not meant to create a tsunami of money towards emerging market economies and so complicated their lives. And similarly, when they are now starting talking about tapering, I don't think that really there is a motivation to gain an unfair advantage over their partners in emerging and developing countries. This is really, I think, in my view, a crucial problem that comes from interdependence, right? So we live in an interdependent world, and when the global financial system is integrated, inevitably, the policies that are decided in one country and are mainly directed at a domestic level may have unpredictable, unintended international consequences. And here it's really the realm of cooperation, diplomacy, right? Because of course, these are problems that need to be addressed. But so really to go back to your question, I would not use the label mercantilism to describe, the outcome of monetary policy in the last 15 years. Because for me, I mean, what's going to happen, especially now that we are talking about inflation recovering and potential interest rate rise, it's not meant to gain an advantage over the others, but it's really a problem of interdependence in an integrated financial system.
Thank you. That's really interesting, because I think the other element, which is perhaps different, but we're just more politically stressed, is the domestic audience for foreign policies. So what you're describing, Manuela, is I think a classic problem if you're the Fed, which is you are targeting inflation and employment in the United States, and then you have these consequences, let's put it that way. But in that sense, it is putting, and the remit of the Fed is to put America first. And when asked about the taper tantrum from a few years ago, the response from the central bankers was very much on what their remit was. And then picking up what Simon said about areas which are not predominantly about the trade balance, because it's about security, it's about other things, begins to, that bolsters, the argument you made earlier, Simon, about positioning other issues, related issues above, trade. So I think both of you have pointed out really important aspects of what economic diplomacy, what's driving it, is actually is different. And that's what makes people think, is it protectionist? Is it a new mercantilist mindset? So Patrick, the question to you is on this mindset, is fundamentally this multilateralism that you're worried about falling apart, and your pension when captured in the WTO, the kind of the international trade part of it, are we really just really worried about countries putting their own interests first, and therefore that's not a multilateral mindset? Or has it been the case that countries have always put their own interests first? They've just somehow been able to occupy the space of being multilateral at the same time. So I'll just give an historical example. The shift to mercantilism in the 19th century was not just the repeal of the Corn Laws, it was this embracing of comparative advantage, the work of David Ricardo, that countries would do well if they were to specialize and trade. So it was never about saying, oh, I'm altruistic. Nobody's altruistic, but it's just reframing what is best for the nation. And then that shift from mercantilism to commercial, this kind of commercial focus of trade, obviously coincided with the rise of multilateralism in the early 20th century as a way to facilitate multilateral trade. So, completely unfair question, Patrick. Is mercantilism doomed because the mindset has changed, but perhaps we're overreading the importance of mindset?
If we take mercantilism in this more literal, traditional sense, it's basically about trade, isn't it? It's basically about exports being good and imports being bad. And frankly, that's just the whole reason for the centrality of the notion of reciprocity in the GATT and now in the WTO really speaks to the fact that mercantilism has always been present in international relations. I think the GATT and the GATT particularly, less the WTO, have been successful because they had quite a bounded environment in which to operate. They were just really dealing with traditional trade flows. And although there was quite a strong mercantilism there, part of that mercantilism was driven in the first place by terms of trade. So there was a certain sense to it. Later on, it became a bit grubbier about what you can grab from someone else. But then if there's a lot of grabbing going on, then maybe you win here and you lose there. And so muddle through, and you had these multilateral trade negotiation outcomes. But it was bounded. It was in its kind of box in a way, and that's what's changed so dramatically. Geopolitics have changed that. Globalization has changed that. Everything's become much more multifaceted, much more difficult. So, for the WTO to keep up with all this, it is very difficult. It has become much more difficult because there's always going to be the spillover into these other questions, which have become so much more important in the last couple of decades. So I don't think really it's about the rise of mercantilism. I think mercantilism has always been in the background, especially in trade relations. It's all these other things now that are going on.
And yeah, I think I think the kind of what's underlying quite a lot of this, and several of you made reference to it, is the fragmentation of the system is, and I think, Patrick, you explicitly set out the different coalitions, EU, US, Japan versus China. So, are we going to be in an era where we continue to have this fragmentation and multilateralism really exists, but in a less relevant way? Because fundamentally, are we ever going to see those coalitions, Patrick, that you describe, come together and say, we're all going to do global rules on e-commerce, on tech, on data, on services? Because if the answer is no, then perhaps we are entering an era where multilateralism exists as a concept, but just isn't really how things are done.
Honest, I think there's always going to be a residual. I'm sorry, I missed a bit of it because Swisscom is not very reliable when it comes to interconnectivity.
Oh dear.
And it cuts out periodically. I've been complaining to them for a while, but nothing happens. So I missed a little bit of it. But yeah, I mean, honestly, I really do question whether this kind of negotiation, the kind of large negotiation we used to rely on in the past to get serious results. I think there's another question: how big is trade going to be in the picture? For ever so long, 2 or 3 times faster was the rate of growth of trade compared to output.
Yeah.
And that has really slowed down. And I think, and I don't think we're going to. I would be surprised if we see that again. So I think there'll be a reboot. There'll be a repositioning of the role of trade, and I think in any case, frankly, I've thought this for a long time. The GATT and WTO have always overplayed their hand with respect to opening markets. They haven't been a very good institution for opening markets. It's either happened unilaterally or preferentially. And there are such a crisscrossing series of preferential agreements now over.
I think Swisscom has frozen Patrick. So Simon, let me come to you. Oh,
13 or 14. So, you know, that is a very muddled kind of setup for trade and for the WTO.
So Patrick, you froze there for just a sec, but I think we caught the gist. I think you don't think there's going to be a new multilateral round launched on services and data that's going to revive multilateralism anytime soon?
You know, it's early days to call it off, to say that nothing's gonna happen. I'm just not sure how far-reaching it will be. And it does raise this really difficult question of whether or not you can rewrite the conventions on non-discrimination in a way that everyone would be willing to live with. The way discrimination fits in the system now has been very carefully tailored. It's the preferential trade agreements and special differential treatment. When you start going very sectoral on it, it's going to be much more difficult.
Thank you. Simon, same question to you. Any chance of a big revival multilateralism, or will the world remain quite fragmented with sort of multilateralism there as a concept?
Okay, let me, if I may, make two comments. One which picks up on what Patrick says, and it feeds into exactly the answer to your question, Linda. So it is true that if you think of the different types of cross-border commerce, cross-border trade in goods is growing as fast as the world economy, not faster anymore. Cross-border FDI is actually growing much slower than world GDP now. In fact, is almost grinding to a halt, is going too far, but it's not. It's getting to the place where it's not really replacing the current stock of depreciated FDI. So you're a cross-border movement of people, of course, very truncated, frustrated because of the pandemic, but never a big area where there was a lot of action. So you're then left really with cross-border services or cross-border delivery of services, and more of that is becoming more digitally delivered. So, you know, if you're looking forward, that's where the action is. So now let's come to your question, Linda. Will we see many global deals in this area? I'm doubtful for the following reason, and it's a really important point which seeds go back many decades. Most of the digital areas are regulated now by independent regulators in countries, not by trade ministries. We created independent regulators to take domestic politics out of regulation. That was why they were created. But those independent regulators love their independence. And the last thing they want to do is to give away some of that independence in deals with others. And even worse, actually, not that's the second last thing they want. The last thing they want is trade negotiators negotiating that on their behalf. So if they do want to cooperate with other regulators and the like, they will probably do it in their own fora rather than at the WTO. And so what we have, I think, is once you get into digital, you're really talking about different regulatory areas. Once you realize most of those regulators are independent with their own non-trade mandates and their own desire to preserve their independent regulatory status, then you do not have a recipe for the type of binding trade deals that we have seen in the past. I think you get a very different form of softer types of cooperation, if any cooperation happens at all. I think that's where the logic takes you.
No, very logical indeed. Manuela, you get the final word, because I think your answer might be slightly more optimistic than the what I find very convincing, but slightly gloomy comments from Patrick and Simon. Because in the area of financial cooperation at the global level, the FSB, and others work fairly well in terms of coordinating regulation. So, final word to you. Perhaps we can see multilateralism, at least in the global financial governance area.
Yeah, I hope not to disappoint you, because while you were talking about fragmentation, had exactly the same organizations that you were mentioning, right? The FSB, the BIS. Traditionally, it is an area where there has been a significant push towards global harmonization, which has, of course, been motivated by the fact that once capital is so mobile, it is international, you really need global rules, otherwise it's nonsense. But going back to the last slide I was presenting, about green finance and digital currencies, I think that at the moment we have a lot of fragmentation. Of course, that as I was saying, the target is moving. But if you think about all the discussion about how to regulate green finance, what are the standards that companies have to abide by when they become listed companies, is still, there is a huge push against, again, towards harmonization, but we are not yet there. And exactly because of the domestic politics that you were mentioning before, there is also huge pressure for countries to move ahead of the others, and this could kind of increase the fragmentation. The same goes for all these projects on digital currencies. Again, there has been a lot of coordination behind the scenes. The BIS, the Bank for International Settlements, they're really trying to then coordinate. But at the moment, I see a lot of fragmentation in this area, but I really don't have a definitive answer. It's very much moving.
Thank you. But I take that as still relatively more optimistic, at least, than what we're facing in terms of the other areas. But unfortunately, we're out of time. That was just such a fantastic and interesting and stimulating discussion and insights. I really like technology, but it at times like this, when the panel is so good, I feel that if we were in a physical room, there would be a rousing round of applause. So, it was absolutely fantastic. Thank you all. So thank you very much to Simon Evenett, Manuela, Moschella, and Patrick Lowe for just a fabulously thoughtful session. Thank you. And I'll hand it back over to the coordinators.